Hello and welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining ERP Corp, the producer of Controlling 2016, for today's webinar. My name is Alice Adams, and I'll be moderating. My colleague John Reed is also on the line and is available for moderation as well. Today's topic is an expert guide to the Asset History Sheet report with Thomas Michael. Before I turn things over to Thomas, I have a couple of housekeeping notes to share with you. We encourage you to post questions as they come up in the QA window, and we'll address those either during the webinar or at the end, depending on our time. And we also invite you to send us any messages using the QA window as well. If you have any technical difficulties, we'd be happy to help you. So Thomas, let's go ahead and turn it over to you. Thanks for hosting today.
Well, thank you very much, Alice, and welcome everyone. I almost wanted to say happy Friday, but I realized it's not Friday, it's Thursday. This is a busy presentation, we've got a lot of slides to go through, a lot of material to cover. So if it feels like I'm rushing too much, just put your comment in the QA box. Say, hey, can you go back one slide and talk about that again? So not a problem. But without further ado, this is a fairly recent picture of me. About myself, I've been in the SAP world for over 20 years, always have been focusing on the asset accounting area. Wrote a book about asset accounting, the reporting guide for asset accounting actually. I speak a lot at SAP conferences, do a lot of these webinars. I also volunteer my time for ASUG, the American SAP User Group. I'm the market leader for asset accounting topics. And if you ever feel like you need to contact me, here is my real email address, tmichael@michaelmanagement.com. I'm always happy to add my 2 cents to whatever question or issue you might have. And with that, let's hop right to it. We're going to talk about the Asset History Sheet report for an hour. And why are we doing this? Because it really is the most powerful report we have in asset accounting. And when we say Asset History Sheet, for those of you that are maybe not too familiar with it just yet, it's just another name for a roll forward report. It has a roll forward layout. The report starts with giving you beginning balances, then it lists all the asset activity, and then it gives you ending balances. The nice thing is that you get all of the asset activity, everything that happened to assets on one page. That makes it a very unique report. No other report does this because this is a report that combines balance-based numbers, balance-based reporting with transaction-based reporting. Right? So if you think about that, if you get beginning balances and ending balances, like the name suggests, these are balance-based reports. And in the middle of the report, you see the transactions, all of the asset activity. And that's why this report is so unique. No other report does this. But, and if there's only one thing that you learn from today's session, that's the big but there's configuration required to make this report work. Again, that's why it's so unique. The other reports work straight out of the box. This report does not. You must configure certain things that I'll show you in order to make this report work. How do you get to it? Well, right here on the menu tree, there it is. There's a technical name for it. I won't pronounce it. There's also a transaction code, the long transaction code that's on the menu tree. I'm not even going to name that, but here's a secret transaction code. Do you see that here at the bottom? AR02. That's a secret shortcut transaction code to start the report. So you don't have to use this long S_ALR blah blah blah. Simply use AR02 to start the report. This report is also very powerful, not just because of what I just told you, but also because you get to control or configure the layout of the report and also the reporting logic. This is something that you actually control in configuration, not SAP. Right? Again, very unique. No other report allows you to do this. And one thing that I always mention is this is called the Asset History Sheet report. And it's not to be confused with the Asset History report. Very similar name, but a totally different report. Has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So again, Asset History Sheet report. What's so special about this report? Well, for one, you have to start this report with what's called a history sheet version. And this version must be configured correctly. Now, SAP delivers a bunch of sample standard history sheet versions, but they're just that. They're samples, they're examples. They're not necessarily good for you to use. When we look at the selection screen of that report, this is pretty far down. This is where you put in this asset history sheet version. And when you start the report, it always starts with this default version 0001. Now that's not a good default version for us to use. Look at the description of this version here. Most people don't spend the extra 2 seconds to really read this or realize what this means. This one says, in compliance with European Community Directive number 4. So that means this is European GAAP accounting. That's not useful at all for the US. Here's a list of all the sample versions SAP delivers in a standard system. And you see that top one here, the 001. All right, that's that default version that always comes in. Again, these are samples only. You should not use these for live reporting in your system. Right? You should really create your own version to meet your reporting requirements. Otherwise, the reporting values that you get won't be good. They won't be applicable, and I'll show you in a second why. This history sheet version, again, super important for this report. What does it do? Well, first of all, it determines what your report looks like, how many columns it has, how many rows it has. So you control that, not SAP. Right? It also controls what values appear where on the report. Just because SAP called something an acquisition doesn't mean you have to show it under the acquisition column. You could show it separately or differently if you want to. That's all totally up to you. Right? That version also controls what values to leave out. So there might be instances where you say, you know what, there's certain values that I don't want to include on my report for certain reasons. Well, that's possible too, and that's all done in the configuration of this version. And last but not least, the version also controls if the report is considered complete or incomplete. Complete meaning that all asset values have been represented. So you can see this version is really important, and if you pick the wrong version, your report values will not be good or usable. Also, if you ever find yourself running this report, and you say, you know what, this report isn't good, it doesn't look good, I don't like it, it doesn't show me what I really need, not a problem. Simply change your history sheet version to make it meet your reporting requirements. Let's take a look at the selection screen of this report. So when we started, the first thing you see on top looks like any other asset report. It's a standard selection screen. Has a bunch of different selection fields right here. If you ever find that, you're looking for a selection field and it's not here on the screen, not a problem. There's something called dynamic selections right there, and that allows you to pull in other fields from the asset master record to use as a selection criteria. And you can't pull in every field from the asset master, but almost every field. So most of them are available. So this part of the selection screen is nothing special, works just like all the other asset reports. And you scroll down, you get to the settings section, and you put in your report date. Now notice you can only put in one date here. So that means this is, by default, a year-to-date report. It will always start at the beginning of the year and end at whatever date you put in here. Okay, very important to remember. You have a couple other fields. Depreciation area obviously allows you to run this report for the financial book, area 1, but also for the tax areas if you want to, and that is a big difference. Right? Certain asset values only apply to the book area, and other asset values only apply to tax areas, and vice versa. Sort version allows you to sort and subtotal the report and pull in additional fields that you want to see as part of your subtotals. So that sort version also very, very important. We could fill an entire another session just talking about sort versions. I don't like that SAP always puts that sort version 001 as a default in there, because that's not the greatest sort version to begin with. It doesn't really match what most people are actually looking for. So same thing here. Spend the extra couple of seconds to do the drop down on the sort version and pick the right sort version that you really want. All right, think about how do you want to sort and subtotal your report. And then last but not least, the translation method. That's always something that not a lot of people are familiar with or use, but it's a very powerful reporting tool. It allows you to run the report in whatever currency you want using whatever exchange rate you want. So just because you run this on area 1, which let's say is configured to be in US dollars, doesn't mean you have to actually look at US dollar values. You can have everything translated into euros, for example, at the daily exchange rate. Now, the translation method allows you to do that. Again, this is stuff for a whole nother conversation, but I just wanted to mention it. Now, if you continue to scroll down on that selection screen, there's a button here that says use ALV grid. If you ever seen that and you don't really know what that means, I'll show you in a little bit. ALV stands for ABAP List Viewer, or some people call it Advanced List Viewer. It basically means it gives you a nicer looking report layout when you run it. It kind of looks like a nice Excel or something that you can download easily in Excel. Right? Every data record, every asset has just one row in the report. Typically, you would always want to turn that on because it gives you a better report layout. And then here is that asset history sheet version, right? So I don't like it that you have to scroll down twice to actually get to this field. It should really be on top because it is so important for this report. Right? The default version that comes in is a 001. Again, not good. Always make sure you spend an extra second and pick the right history sheet version. And then last but not least, there's a button here that says depreciation posted. That one controls the depreciation values that are on your report. Now, are you talking about planned depreciation or posted depreciation? Big difference. The report allows you to do both. All right, so that was the selection screen. Now let's say we run this report. What does it look like? What's the report output? It looks like this. Now notice this is not the ALV grid option. I specifically did not turn that on. Reason being, I can fit the entire report on one screenshot. If I would have turned on the ALV grid, it would have been wider than my screen can actually display. Now when you run this report, the very first thing that you should do is you should look at the header on top, right here. Look at what it says. It says, in compliance with European Community Directive number 4. So it tells me what version was used to run this report, right? So I used that 001 version, that default version. And also notice that word at the very end there, incomplete. So it tells me that this report that I ran is not configured correctly. It is, in fact, incomplete. There might be asset values that were posted that are not represented on this report. So let that sink in for a second. There might be asset values that have been posted that are not represented on this report. Thus, this is incomplete. Now, if you're an auditor or if you show this report to an auditor, the very first thing out of that person's mouth should be, I'm not accepting this. This report is incomplete. I don't know if you're showing me all values or not. All right? So if you run that report in your own system and you see incomplete, I would not accept it as an auditor. I would send it back saying, nope, show me a complete report only. So very, very, very important little word. All right. Like I mentioned, the report has a roll forward layout. It starts with the beginning of the fiscal year values, right to the left, this column there. You see the acquisition cost, depreciation, and book value of all the assets. And then on the right, you see the ending values, right, where it says current acquisition cost, current book value. Those are current as of whatever report date you put in there. All right, so I put in that report date 12/31, so those are the values as of 12/31. Now, everything in the middle here, those are the asset transactions, all the asset activity that was posted between these two dates. All right, and you see there's a column for acquisitions, one for retirements, one for transfers, and so on. Okay, so that's why it's called a roll forward report, because you can roll the values from one column to the next to get to the very end. Now, remember what I just said about the posted versus planned depreciation, right? So I ran this report with planned depreciation, and I already talked about this here. And here on the here's an asset, and the report says this asset has planned depreciation in the amount of $6,242. All right, sounds good. Let's take a look and verify that number by looking at the asset in the Asset Explorer. All right, so right there I go to the Planned Values tab and I see the amount, same amount, $6,242. So my Asset Explorer, my report match, they show the same values. Very good, we like that. Now I'm going to rerun that exact same report, and the only thing I do is I turn on depreciation posted. All right, I just click on that little button and I run the report again. And now I get this output. On top it says posted depreciation. It didn't say that a second ago on that other slide. All right, now it says, hey, these are posted values, and here's my asset. But my depreciation went down to 0. So what happened? Where did the depreciation go? It just said $6,000. Now it says 0. Any thoughts or ideas? You can type in your answer in your little Q&A box, which I can't see, by the way. Do you see anything, Alice? Anybody saying anything?
Not yet. I can also adjust it so you can see the box as well.
Yeah. So where did the depreciation go? Any guesses? That's the big difference between posted and planned depreciation. Let's take a look at the Asset Explorer again for this asset. Maybe we can find out. So we're back at the Asset Explorer. Values tab.
Thomas, we do have one input. Depreciation was not posted as the
Ding, ding,
audience
ding, ding,
suggestion.
Very, very nice, very good. So somebody already knows this. You can see in the Asset Explorer right here that the status of the depreciation postings, right, the $500 every month here, the status is in fact planned, meaning it has not been posted. Right? So everybody now probably goes like, oh yeah, duh, of course, right? But that's why I always tell people, whenever you look at any asset report for that matter, always make sure you are aware of what values you're looking at, because there's a giant difference between planned and posted values. All right. All right, so we determined that this report is in fact okay. These values make sense. Now, before we move on to talk about configuration, I want to talk about the limitations of this report. This report is my favorite report. It's the most powerful report that we have in asset accounting. I use it all the time, but it has two big limitations. The first one is, like I mentioned, it's a year-to-date report. You can only run it from January 1st through whatever month I want this year. That means I can't run it just for the month of March, for example, or I can't run it for the second quarter of this fiscal year. It doesn't allow me to do that because it will always start on the first day of the year. It means I'll never get a beginning balance for March 1st, let's say. All right? That's a big problem. I can't really use this then well to reconcile on a monthly basis, right, if I don't have a starting value. The other problem is, once I close the fiscal year, I can't run it for any other date other than 12/31 or the last day of whatever your fiscal year is. All right, so that means I can't go back into last year and just run it for September 30th. It doesn't allow that anymore. So those are two very big shortcomings of that standard report. And they're so big that a lot of our customers complained about it. Here on the report screen, you see what I mean, right? So you put in the report date, there's no from period. It's always year to date, right? So, and if I try to do 9/30 of 2009, for example, I'll get this error message. It will tell me, hey, that report date is invalid for this report because that fiscal year is already closed. If this was an open fiscal year, yes, I could run it, right? If it would say 2016, I could run it for that date. But if I wanted to go back into a closed fiscal year, this is the error message I get. Say, nope, you can't do that anymore. Now that's a big problem, especially when the auditors come in and say, hey, show me that report for last September. I want to audit you. I want to see what values were posted. When you tell the auditor, well, I'm sorry, but I can't. Right? It doesn't do that. So what we did is we created an enhancement to this report that addresses these two issues. So with this enhancement, you can actually now run this asset history sheet report for any period, an open or closed fiscal years, and you can run it for a period or a range of periods. So no more year to date. Any period from period 3 to 5, for example, it'll work just fine. So for example, this is the selection screen of the enhanced version. Notice that it says based on periods on top, and you now have a from and to period to select from. Okay, so that allows you to run this on a single period or a range of periods. When you run it, it looks like this. Just like the standard report, the only difference is now it says it was run based on periods, and here it actually tells you what the periods were, periods 3 to 5 in this example. And now these columns here that show you the beginning values, they're not the beginning values of January 1st. They're in fact the beginning values of period 3, so March 1st. Sorry.
Hey, Thomas, we just have one quick clarification from Pat again. She's just asking closed fiscal year in terms of asset fiscal year, not financial, correct?
Correct, yes. Exactly. So this report allows you to run it for any period in open or closed fiscal years, and that's closed in asset accounting. It doesn't matter. So you can still run it just for September of last year, for example. That would totally be possible. The reason why we did this, or now that if you have this enhancement, you can literally reconcile your subledger to your general ledger in 5 minutes. Right? You simply run this report with a sort version that subtotals by GL account, and then you just look at your GL account balances using transaction FS10N, for example, and you just compare, and I can reconcile the two ledgers in 5 minutes. And also now I can support any audit with a report. All right. So it's a very simple enhancement, installs in 30 minutes on your system. If you want to learn more about it or see a little demo of what I'm talking about, you can go to this link and take a look. And Alice, I'm sure you're going to share these slides with everyone on the webinar, right?
Yes, I will.
Okay, so you'll get that link. All right, so now's a good time to stop for a second. We covered what I call the end user side of this report, right? So you know how to, what's so special about the report. You know how to start it, right? What the selection screen looks like. You know what the report output looks like, and you know what the report's limitations are. Before we get into the configuration for this report, are there any questions for the end user side? You can use your little chat box or Q&A box, I should call it, and type in your question right there. And if you don't have a question, then I will gracefully move on to the configuration part of this. in order to configure this, there's a few things you need to know or to understand. It requires knowledge of transaction types in asset accounting, so-called asset history sheet groups, and so-called history sheet positions. And the task here really is not just to configure the system, but most of the time spent on getting this to work will be on testing. And I'll show you what I mean now in the following slides. First, let's understand transaction types. If you're familiar with asset accounting a little bit, you already know that every asset transaction that gets posted, without exception, requires a transaction type. That's pretty unique to the asset accounting submodule, if you will, or component. Other subledgers don't have these transaction types, right? There's no such thing in accounts receivable or accounts payable. They don't use transaction types. Only asset accounting does. And this transaction type, right here at the bottom, for example, is 100 is an acquisition. Controls several things in the system, not just if it's a debit or credit, but mainly it helps the system understand what type of transaction you're posting to an asset. Oops. So asset transactions could be acquisitions, retirements, transfers, other adjustments, right? So just by looking at a debit credit, I couldn't tell the difference between a retirement versus a transfer out, right? It will both be a credit on the sending asset. So that's why we need this transaction type in order to classify further what type of transaction we post. If you go into the configuration for these transaction types, here's a configuration screen for it. SAP has done most of the config for you already. All right, so there's probably 200-300 of these transaction types standard delivered in the system. You can create your own if you want to. And most of the stuff is already configured. Now notice that I say most of it, not all of it. All right? And for the purpose of this asset history sheet report to work properly, there's one thing that you need to configure or at least verify. Each transaction type must be linked to what's called an asset history sheet group. Do you see that here down at the bottom, that red box? So this transaction type 100, it's an external asset acquisition, meaning we just bought an asset from an external source, is assigned to a history sheet group number 10 called acquisitions. Okay? So this asset history sheet group is used to group transaction types together. Not the same, but they're similar. Right? So for example, here's a list of history sheet groups, 10s acquisitions, 20s retirements, 30s transfers, and so on. Right? And each one of these groups combines or groups together a list of transaction types. So for example, this number 10, acquisitions, groups together all of these transaction types here on the list. So we saw this 100 here was an external acquisition. 101 is also an acquisition, but for a negative asset. 110 is an in-house acquisition. 105 is a credit memo. They're all considered acquisitions, even though they're different debits and credits, right? But they're all considered acquisitions. So to make it easy for us to configure this report now, we're going to group similar transaction types together in an asset history sheet group. That's all you do. You're just assigning a bunch of transaction types to certain history sheet groups. So if you're trying to do this yourself in your own system, here's a little to-do list that I wrote for you. The very first thing you need to do in your own system, if you take this back to work now, first you got to go through all of the transaction types that SAP delivers. Again, there's probably 200-300 on that list. You need to go through that list and identify the ones that you actually use. Most likely you don't even use half of the ones that SAP delivers. Right? But if you've never done this exercise, now is a good time. Go through them and say, hey, are we using transaction type 100? Yes or no? Are we using 101? Yes or no? And so on. And do that for all of them. And then consider that all the ones that you're not using, consider locking them. There's an option to do that in configuration. Or you might want to limit access to certain transaction types. You say, oh, no, this requires manager approval, so only a manager should be allowed to use this certain transaction types. And you can do that with a user exit very easily, right? The reason why you're doing this is to A, make it easy for the end users to pick the right transaction type, and B, to get consistency, right? You don't want somebody to just take any transaction type that the system allows and post stuff, right? You want consistency in the way you process asset transactions. And then once you have the list of actual transaction types you are using, and I would be surprised if it's more than 50 or so, now make sure that these transaction types are in fact assigned to the correct asset history sheet group, or assigned at all. Some might not even be assigned. So that's your to-do. Oh, also one more thing: if you are in a system where you work with multiple countries, remember that each country has their own reporting requirements, and they're different from U.S. reporting requirements. So for example, what we consider an asset transfer here in the U.S. is absolutely not the same that an asset transfer in Germany would be. There are very big differences in the two. All right? So if you run that report with European GAAP accounting rules, your transfer column will not be correct for U.S. GAAP purposes, and vice versa. So always keep that in mind. You're not just working in a isolated system or in a vacuum. If there's other countries that use the same transaction types, make sure you consider their reporting requirements too before you just make changes. All right, so let's assume you found all the transaction types you use, and let's assume you have now assigned all these transaction types to these history sheet groups. The next step is to configure the asset history sheet version. This is the one that we were talking about, right? This SAP example 0001 in compliance with EC directive, blah, blah. Don't change that. I'm just using this as an example for this presentation. In real life, you would, of course, create your own version, a Z something something version, that you would create the configuration there. When you go into the configuration for this, and this is transaction OA79, for those of you that like to use transaction codes, notice that you see the report layout down here, right? We looked at this. We said, oh yeah, in the first column we saw the acquisition cost, the depreciation, book value. The next column showed us the acquisition, and we saw the retirements and so on. So this is the part that you get to configure. If you don't like this layout, simply change it. You get to decide what's on your report and in what order, right? And SAP calls these cells here positions, asset history sheet positions. Think of them as a bucket of values, right? So the acquisition position is just a collection of all the acquisition transactions that we posted in the system. Same with the retirements. All of the retirement transactions we posted in the system. Now you can double click each one of these positions to configure what goes into that bucket. Now if you think about this report, there's a lot of positions on here, right? So this is not the entire report. There's additional columns here. There's the ending balances at the very end. So there's quite a few of these things that you need to configure. And you start that by simply double clicking one of these positions. So I would double click that acquisitions field right here, and I would see this screen. Right? It tells me that I am in the acquisitions position right here, and now it shows me the asset history sheet groups, a long list. You only see the first 3, 4 here, but there's probably 20 on that list, so the list keeps going. Right? Now remember, I assigned all the transaction types to the history sheet group, right? And now I need to assign this group to this position for acquisitions, and I do that by placing an X in this transaction column here, right here on that line. Okay, so if I place an X here, I basically tell the system, hey, all the transaction types that are grouped together under group 10, I want to show the transactions in this position. Right? So it's just a simple assignment exercise, but it gets very tedious because you have a lot of transaction types, a lot of groups, and a lot of positions. But all you're doing is you're assigning one to the other to the next. Right? Now, if you see a dot in one of these fields right here, that means that this field was already assigned somewhere else. So it helps you a little bit so that you don't double assign something. Now, one thing to remember is SAP will not keep you from double assigning a group to a position. So just because this has a dot in here, this field, I can actually override it and just put an X in there too. If I did that, I would not get a warning message, I would not get an error message, but in fact, I just doubled up certain values on the report and I wouldn't see that. Okay, so it's very important to remember. It's up to you when you configure this to make sure that you don't accidentally double assign values.
Hey Thomas, let's just interrupt for just 1 sec. Ask the other organizers just to make sure your phones are on mute, please. Thank you.
Yes, I keep hearing somebody with, it sounds like a bread slicer. Somebody's making a sandwich for lunch. Now let's take a look at what these columns actually mean here. TRN stands for transactions, right? So if I post an acquisition transaction, that's the actual transaction amount, that's the acquisition amount I'm posting. And the fields here next to them are for accumulated depreciation, ordinary, special, and unplanned. Right? Well, with an acquisition, I typically wouldn't have that, but if I posted a retirement to an asset, I would, right? I would have the retirement amount, that's the amount of cost that I'm retiring, that would be under transactions, and then I would have the value adjustment, the depreciation, show up under ordinary, special, or unplanned depreciation. So that's how you read this table, and each one of these either needs an X or a dot, and again, you don't put the dot in there, the system does. All right? The system just puts the dot in automatically if this thing was assigned somewhere else already on your history sheet. Important to remember. And yeah, so that's what you have to do for all of the transaction types, all of the transaction type groups, and all of the asset history sheet positions. So it's not complicated, but tedious. When you do this for all of these various positions, eventually you're going to be done and your history sheet should be complete. See this indicator right here? Now mine is not complete. Do you remember when I ran this report and on top in the header it said incomplete? That's what this is referring to. SAP tells me, yeah, this history sheet is not complete. This is not a button that I get to click on. It's SAP that turns this on or off based on my configuration. It tells me, yep, you've done a good job, you're complete, you're done. Or in this case, it tells me, nope, you're not done, you're missing something. Okay? So make sure that whatever history sheet version you create or configure, that it's complete. There's very, very, very few situations where I would accept an incomplete version. All right? And again, just think about how you want to explain that to the auditor when he looks at the report. So this little button is your friend. It tells you if you're done with config or not. So I got another to-do list for you. The next steps for you, if you want to do this, you create your own history sheet version. Again, don't use one of the sample SAP versions and just start overwriting this. Instead, copy a version, and you can start with that 001. That's typically what I do. You know, it's not good for US GAAP reporting, but I like to copy it because it gives me a little bit of a head start. Right? Copy it to Z something something and then start configuring it according to your requirements. Now, consider that you want different, multiple versions. One version is probably not going to cut it. For example, there's differences in asset reporting requirements for book versus tax. So for example, I'm working with a client right now that is being bought out by another company, so they have to revalue their assets, and these revaluations get posted to the book areas only. As a result, when they run a report on the book side, they want to see a column that shows these revaluation amounts. But the tax guys, the revaluation amounts don't get posted to tax. So the tax guys say, well, I don't care. I don't want to see a column for revaluations because it means nothing for tax reporting. So that's why we have to create two separate versions, one for book, one for tax. And also remember that example I brought up. If you, let's say you have a US company and on the same system you also have a German company or French or whatever, right? They have different reporting requirements than we would have in the US. So as a result, you will end up with multiple history sheet versions, one for the US, one for Germany, for example. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, make sure that all these versions are complete, right? SAP will tell you this is not something that you get to turn on and off. If you do a good job with config, SAP will turn that on automatically. Make sure they're all complete. All right. So that's the config. So you can see the config is really not that much, right? It's just a few steps, but you have to repeat these steps hundreds of times. So that's why this becomes very tedious. Now, if you would like to learn more about this report, this asset history sheet report, or reporting in general for asset accounting, there's a lot to it, obviously. Here's a link to my book. That's the book that I wrote on asset accounting reporting. There's a separate chapter in there just for the asset history sheet, so you can learn a little bit more. And again, Alice will send you a copy of these slides, so you can just click on that link. No need to write this down. And before we get into more Q&A, let me give you 5 things to take home from this session. Remember that this history sheet report is the most powerful report in asset accounting that we have. If you're not using it, you're totally missing out. It is really the greatest report. I use it all the time. But remember also, there's a little bit of config that is required. You have to create this history sheet version. Don't use these SAP examples. The basic report layout is a roll forward report, right? So it shows beginning balances on one side, ending balances on the other side, and all of the asset activity broken out by detail in the middle. And that's why this report is so special. No other report does that. Remember, the standard report has 2 significant limitations. You cannot run it for separate periods, only year to date, and you can also not run it for any period once you close the fiscal year. Then you can only report on the entire fiscal year. And the solution to that obviously is this enhancement that I mentioned, which does in fact allow you to run it for any period or any range of periods in open or closed fiscal years. Before we get into Q&A, let's talk real quick about the controlling conference in San Diego. And Alice, is that something that you want to share with everyone, or do you want me to share?
I can just say a couple quick things. Before I do that, I'd encourage people to go ahead and put their Q&A in so that we can for sure to respond to those. But if you want to hear more from Thomas, the Controlling Conference is a great place to do that. It's September 12th through 15 in San Diego. And we set up a discount just for today's webinar attendees who aren't already registered. The code is Assets Webinar, and I'll be sending that out in an email, so you can keep an eye out for that. And as Thomas mentioned, we'll make a recording of the webinar along with the slides available early next week on the ERP Corp blog. So that's all for me on the conference. Thomas, did you want to add anything, or should we go to questions?
Actually, I'll add a piece. I speak a lot at conferences, and I really like it, and I like the community that we build around this, and I like to share knowledge with other people. And you could literally go to a conference every month of the year, but I don't. I can't. So I pick the ones that are the best. And this conference is one of the best. That's the one that I always go to every year. Because it is so great. So if you've never been, I totally encourage you to go. You'll learn a ton, you'll meet a bunch of new people, and you'll just broaden your professional skill set and network. And I didn't even know about the $100 off. That's even better. And with that, I go into Q&A. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask. We have a few minutes. I know this was a lot of information, and I know that I went through it pretty fast, so we can go back and talk about something again, or if you have any questions, how to approach it or tackle it at your own company, now's the time to ask. And if you can't think of a question now, here's my email. You can always shoot me an email later and say, I forgot to ask you one thing.
We do have a couple of questions in the queue. The first one is, are the columns of the report configurable?
Yes, good question. Let me see if I go back real fast. So here, where you configure the history sheet version, that's transaction OA79. This is where you get to add, delete, change the report layout. All right. So for example, this column 10 here shows acquisitions and depreciation for the year. If you want to insert another column before it or after it, or if you want to delete this or move it over one spot, you can do all of those things here. Remember one thing though, you cannot have more than 8 columns in the report, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 8. And each column can't have more than 10 lines. So that's 80 data fields in the report. That's a ton. Nobody ever uses it. You see this report only uses 3 lines, right? So cost in the first one, then depreciation, then book value. That's only 3 lines, and it probably has, I don't know, 6 columns or so. All right.
Okay, great. Next question from Pat. What version is the enhancement available for?
4.7 and forward. So if you're on a modern release, we have that version available. In fact, I was talking to a new client this morning, and get this, they're on release 4.6D still. Now, I've been around the block for a little bit, and I don't know. I haven't talked to anybody that's on 4.6D in 10 years, so I thought it was pretty impressive.
Okay, it looks like we have a couple more, and we have a few minutes left, so any final questions that you want to get in, now's the time to ask. Is it okay to use the standard SAP history sheet version?
No, not really. So the one thing that I wanted to drive home is SAP delivers these sample trend history sheet versions, right? The 001, that's that default version that always comes up. But it's really just that. It's a sample, an example. It's not complete. SAP says, listen, this isn't a sample. We're not configuring this thing completely for you. You need to do that, right? So don't do that. Spend the extra time to create your own version.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. I think these are probably our last 2 here. This one's from Paul. Do you have a complete version of the default 0001 version?
No, so SAP delivers this, right? So we typically don't want to start changing that. What I do when I work with clients on this, I typically copy this, 001, I call it Z whatever. And what you can't see in this screenshot, there's a menu bar here on top, and under the edit function, there's a completeness check. All right, so I know that this version is not complete, right, because this little button is not turned on, but I don't know why. So in the menu, there's an option where you say completeness check, and it shows you a little pop-up window, and it will tell you why this is not complete, right? And it will tell you specifically, so your transaction type 100 is not assigned to a group, or the group is assigned, but you didn't assign the depreciation for it. So it will actually tell you exactly what you still need to complete.
Okay. And then we have another question from Pat. Is there a specific SAP note for the enhancement? How can we find the info to advise basis?
Yes, this is
team.
right. This is not an SAP product. This is our own product. We at Micromanagement, we have developed this, and God, where is that link? We have developed this enhancement. If you go to our website, and the link was in here somewhere. Here it is, at the bottom. Go to the website, and you end up on a page where you can actually see that enhancement. You see a demo of it, just 3 minutes, real quick. It's me walking through it. And you can purchase it directly from us on the website, or you just contact me, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. But it's not an SAP product. It's also not something that changes any SAP code. So this is completely separate and custom. No SAP object or code is being changed.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've answered. Oh, let's see. It might be good if Thomas, if you and Pat connect offline about some additional questions.
Yeah, that'd be great, Pat. Let's do that. I'll tell you more about it. One thing that I wanted to mention, I think I forgot to mention that. When you go back now and you start configuring this and you suddenly realize, oh my God, it's a lot of work. I know I'm just assigning one object to another, but oh, there's a lot. Yes, there's a lot. I've done thousands of these, and it takes me a full day just to configure it and then to test it. Right? And what I do is when I configure this, I go in here, right, where you do all these assignments right here. All right, so I place my X, and then I save it. Then I go to a test asset, and I post a transaction to that asset with this transaction type, and then I run the report that I'm creating, the version, to make sure that the amount that I just posted shows up in the field or in the column where I want to see it. And that's the part that takes time, because I'm doing this for all of these buckets, right? So I post a few acquisitions, and I'm posting a few retirements and transfers and so on. And that's why it takes me an entire day to do this. And mind you, I've done a lot of these before. So don't feel bad if you figure, my God, this is 3 days of work. That's okay.
Great. So I don't know, Thomas, do you have any final comments before we wrap up? Or maybe that was your final comment.
That was my final comment. Thanks y'all for joining. I hope you got value out of it, and I hope see some of you at the conference in September. Right here is the link again, controlling.erpcorp.com. Go there, and we'll meet up in San Diego.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you so much, Thomas, for presenting. We really appreciate it. As we said, we'll make the slides as well as a recording available next week. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Thomas and myself. Thank you. Bye-bye.